Whenever you rent or buy a video, you need to be sure that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home.
Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream. Scream for your lives.
Hey weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cuppa. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today is here to tell us to get out or he'll shout our bloody ears off. Welcome, Sean Hogan. How you doing, mate?
I'm good. It's good to be here. Good to be back. And yeah, lots of stuff to talk about, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you came on, this is your second time on the podcast. So you came on, I think it was episode 4 you came on and we talked about Messiah of Evil, which was good fun. And then I've kind of seen you in the meantime. So I keep bumping into you at Broadway Cinema. So I saw you on Sunday, was it? Friday, wasn't it? Yeah. So,
Friday, yeah.
So what film were you going to see again? It's part of Mayhem, wasn't it?
Yes, I was going to see the revival screening of Hollywood 90028, which is a sort of fairly obscure 70s film that I've been wanting to see for quite a while, but it's been almost impossible to see for years. But now it's been restored. So yeah, I went along to check that out.
And how did you find it?
It was a very odd but interesting film. It wasn't quite what I was expecting. It's sort of kind of in a similar way to sort of Messiah of Evil. Actually, it kind of straddles that line between art house and grindhouse. But if anything, it's even artier than Messiah of Evil, with a couple of like grindhousey elements thrown in. And you know, a lot of it is just sort of a study in kind of LA alienation. You know, with a slightly kind of exploitation movie subplot. But it's a very sort of, yeah, I can't imagine what people would have made of it at the time. The director, that's her only sort of feature credit, and I'm not really surprised. I can't imagine they would have been beating down her door to give her another shot after that. But looking at it now, it's a really interesting film, and it has one of the all-time great closing shots in it as well. So yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. I think there's definitely a US release on the horizon. So yeah, give it a look.
Yeah, I went. Yeah, on the same night I went to see Time Stalker, Alice Lowe's new film, and yeah, I really enjoyed that. I'm a big Alice Lowe fan anyway, but I think if yeah, Time Stalker's kind of it's not horror in the same way that Prevenge was kind of horror. It's more weird fantasy, but yeah, it's got a kind of you if you like Alice Lowe, you probably like it. If you don't like Alice Lowe, you probably won't. It is very Alice Lowe. It's got all the
Right.
kind of it's very funny, but it's also incredibly sad and poignant as well. So yeah, I liked it, and
Cool.
it's very very nice. But yeah, but previous to seeing you, so I saw you last Friday at the Broadway. I think the previous time I saw you at Broadway was when you were there to talk about or introduce your film to fire You Come at Last. And I think it's yeah, I mean, I think last time when we spoke you'd done the film and you'd kind of talked, you know, that you were starting to do publicity, but at that point I'd not seen it. So I came to see the Q&A and I saw the film, and yeah, and it was everything, you know, I'm not just saying this, it was everything I was hoping it'd be, really. I think if people haven't seen it, they should see it, and it is going to be available as a, you know, a digital. It's going to be available as a on a physical release when Severin released their All the Haunts Be Yours, which is kind of their second sort of folk horror box set. But yeah, in terms of Sean's film, can't recommend it enough, really. If anybody, if people are into, and it is very much its own thing. I'm not going to say, you know, I'm not trying to tie it, just lump it in with other things. Yeah, obviously it's got those folk horror elements, but also if you like the kind of those BBC adaptations of the M.R. James stuff from the 70s. It does have that feel as well, but it does so the story and what the subject it tackles. It does something very original, and I loved it. I thought it was great, Sean.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so it's the Severin box set, I believe, is starting to ship now, well, if not now, but imminently. I think the box sets have reached the warehouse, so they should be going out soon. But it will also be getting a streaming release fairly soon after that, which hasn't been announced yet, so I can't give out the details. But it's, I think, sort of quite fittingly, given that it is kind of intended in the spirit of those sort of Christmas ghost stories that the BBC did in the 70s. It will be sort of coming out around Christmas via streaming as well. So yeah, if you can't afford to shell out significant bucks for the Severin box set, which is kind of a pricey, weighty item, then yes, you should hopefully get a chance to see it digitally too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you have got a bit of Christmas money, I think, it is, they are pricey items, those box sets from Severin. I've got the first folk horror box set, All the Haunts Be Ours, but if you can afford to stretch to that, if you got some Christmas money, like I said, they are incredible. That I mean, the first set is incredible. It's just this cornucopia of folk horror adjacent sort of delights, really. It's just wonderful, from all these kind of weird films from around the world. It's fantastic box set, and there's a great documentary as part of it as well. So yeah, I'm really looking
Yeah, I
forward
mean
to.
they're sort of beautifully put together sets and really well curated by Kayla Janice. And I think this set, even more so, has gone, to the far flung corners of the world to sort of find all this, kind of like more obscure instances of folk horror. So, it was a real privilege to be asked to be a part of it. Um, you know, because I hadn't made anything for a while. So when Kayla came to me and said, I'd love you to do something for this set, and I already had the first one, like you. I was like, yeah, amazing. And then it kind of ballooned from there. It was originally meant to be a short film, and it kind of expanded somewhat beyond that. So it's kind of now is like a mid-length feature that was, yeah, like, as I say, very much intended to be in the spirit of the sort of 70s BBC ghost stories for Christmas.
Yeah, and I guess as well the subject matter, because you're kind enough to send me a copy of your most recent novel, The Corpse Road. So I'm guessing this some. I mean, just literally just started reading the first chapter, but it's kind of like I'm guessing, given the title, that there is some sort of crossover, not in terms of necessarily an actual physical connection, but in terms of the subject matter of To Fire You Come at Last and The Corpse Road. Is that right?
Yeah, it's kind of it's been a bit of a sort of arse backwards process actually. The
Usually the
Corpse
case.
Road, so the novel, The Corpse Road, which, as you say, is literally just come out. I did a launch for it about a week or so ago. Um, that was a story that I've had in my head for like the last 10, 15 years. Um, I originally wrote it as a screenplay. Um, and that kind of came about because I discovered all this sort of mythology about corpse roads. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know, corpse roads are the pathways upon which coffins used to be carried to the churchyards hundreds of years ago, where you had all these sort of far-flung rural villages, and bodies were, had to be buried in the local churchyard, which was sometimes miles away from these villages. So they had designated routes along which the coffins would have to be carried, because there was all this superstition about, the effects of bodies, and that they would corrupt the earth underneath them, and landowners didn't want them being carried across their land. Farmers, you weren't allowed to carry them across, fields that were being farmed. And all this superstition grew up around them, that these roads were haunted by not only ghosts but devils and various other beings, and that there were down to really specific things like you had to carry the body's feet first, because otherwise they might find the ghosts might find their way back home, and all this like fascinating mythology. And I came across all this stuff, and I was like, I can't believe no one's ever done anything with this. So I ended up using some of it in this script called The Corpse Road, which nothing ever happened with. Um, and so, fast forward ahead sort of 10 years or so, after I'd finished my first proper book, England Screaming, I suddenly thought, it might be worth me having a punt at writing a more conventional novel. I do consider England Screaming a novel, but it's not a conventional novel. And I sort of thought maybe I should give that a go. And it was round about the time lockdown hit, so I had sort of time on my hands. And I suddenly thought, oh, that story, The Corpse Road, that I think that would really work as a novel. And it was always a story I'd been very keen on. It had never entirely left me. So I sort of quickly figured out a way to do it as a novel and sat down and wrote it. And the novel, the story is basically the same as the original screenplay, but it's got a lot more meat on its bones. I sort of wove in a lot more kind of English folklore, and whereas the original screenplay was sort of more from the point of view of one of the two sisters who are the main characters in the novel's actually narrated by both of them, so it sort of skips back and forth between them, and that sort of, I think, gave it a whole extra dimension that the screenplay didn't have. So that was, and Corpse Road mythology does play a part in it, but it's more of a sort of backdrop to the novel, and I sort of wove in some of my own elements as well. But I'd done all this research on Corpse Roads anyway, so I knew all about it. And then when a little bit after that, before the novel was actually due to come out, Kayla contacted me about doing this film for the box set, and her brief to me was, I just want you to do something that involves some kind of ritual. And she kind of gave a couple of examples and mentioned Corpse Roads as one of them, and I was like, I know all about Corpse Roads. So I had one idea which was completely separate and was more of a conventional short film, 15, 20 minutes, 20 pages. But then I had this other idea about Corpse Roads. And I was like, well, I loved that subject matter. And, at this point, the novel still hadn't come out. And I was like, well, I could use all that stuff. And then the story just kind of came to me. And I imagined these four guys carrying a coffin along the road. And it just kind of all cohered in my head. And I was like, all right, yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do the Corpse Road thing. And so now I've kind of, what with that and the novel coming out within about a year of each other, I've sort of staked out that niche for myself, I guess, as the Corpse Road guy.
You wait ages
so
for a Corpse Road story, and then two come along at once.
Exactly. So I think I've mined it pretty thoroughly now. The two stories are very different. There isn't really any overlap between them. As I say, the film is set in period. It concerns itself with a lot of the direct folklore about Corpse Road and takes place on a Corpse Road, whereas in the novel, which is contemporary, it's much more of a sort of backdrop and woven in with a lot of other elements. So they are very different stories, but hopefully they kind of complement each other in some interesting ways.
Excellent. Well, as I said, I mean, the short film is, also the film you did is, very much falls within the remit of the kind of folk. I know that phrase has been overused, and it's kind of like it kind of came out of nowhere a few years back, and it doesn't necessarily mean that much. And I think we've discussed before, and we've kind of agreed that Witchfinder General's not really a folk horror film. It's all this kind of stuff. But
yeah, I mean, I spent a whole commentary track talking about how it wasn't really a folk horror film. But it's, I mean, yeah, I think it's one of those things. I have, I think it can be over applied. I think people are in too much of a hurry to call everything folk horror, and I mean, I certainly have certain thoughts about that. At the same time, I also think my comparison is always film noir, in that folk horror, what we now call folk horror, existed for decades before anyone tried to codify it, much like film noir did. It was just
exactly.
sort of someone came along and said, "Oh, here's a label," and much like film noir, the borders of what is or isn't folk horror are somewhat vague and are open to interpretation. And some people will argue one way, and some people will argue another. But it's like noir; it's never going to go away. It will always be
No.
with us. People are going to carry on making folk horror films even after this current fervor for it stops, which you inevitably will. But those films will carry on being made because they always have been made.
And I think because obviously when guests come on this podcast for the first time, I always ask them, how they got into horror at an early age and what was their first kind of. So obviously I'm not going to do that again, but I do, just tapping into that. I think that yeah, I mean, obviously as that those box sets we talked about, they prove that, folk horror, whatever you want to call it, these kind of films, they exist in all cultures, in all countries. There are different versions of kind of American folk horror or Australian or whatever. And yeah, I think there is something very intrinsically British about it. And it's not even just your kind of classic folk horrors. So the film we're going to look at later on, I kind of roughly lump that in as kind of seaside horror. It's, and I think it's got I think the film we're going to look at has got less in common, say, with those classic folk horrors like Blood on Satan's Claw or whatever, what have you. But I think but it does feel as though it fits into the same universe as, say, Whistle and I'll Come to You. There's something almost indescribable about that those kind of feelings that some certain British films from a certain era elicit. I think there's a whole different conversation about British horror. I think British horror does things that horror doesn't do in other countries. But there's something about the film we're going to talk about later on, but also that idea of the seaside, the off-season seaside, the grey waters lapping against these sad-looking beaches. I think that is a whole thing in itself.
Yeah, definitely. There's just something about the sort of the eeriness and the kind of liminality of the English coastline that really lends itself to those kind of stories. I think I actually made a short film a few years ago, which also is going to be included on the Haunts box set alongside To Fire, which was very much in that kind of vein. It was something I made that Kayla commissioned me to make, and she wanted sort of a Christmas ghost story. And it was, and it's a conventional short film. It's sort of 15-20 minutes long. Um, and yeah, I wanted to sort of do something that evoked that kind of feeling because that's something I find very powerful. The feeling of Whistle I'll Come to You and Warning to the Curious.
Yes.
That sort of just desolate oddness about those films was something that I really wanted to have a crack at. So yeah, that film's going to be included in the box set as well. Not really folk horror, but what the hell?
No, but like I said, I don't even know what it is. I mean, I remember um because yeah, I wrote this book about Alice Lowe's Revenge, so obviously I interviewed her quite a lot, and I was talking to her about what she saw as being, what is it about, typically British horror or just British films, and why are they so different? And she came up with this really great phrase. It was like, well, you've got all these things like you might have like Lord of the Rings or Hobbits or this kind of horrific stuff happening in the foreground, but in the background you've also got Kathy Burke sat on a wall smoking a fag. So I think in terms of what we're looking at, the film we're going to introduce shortly, there is something so as much as it is kind of out in the wilds in some way, and you're next to the sea, it's also there's something dismal and almost rising damp element. It's a very late 70s film, I think.
Yes, and very English as well in its way. Although it sort of
Yes,
kind of takes in mythology from another country, as we'll see.
yes,
There is something very English about it, which is sort of one of the aspects I want to talk about. And again, and that's interesting. And in the same sort of way that it felt when I made To Fire You Come at Last, it felt very natural to me to kind of have this subtext in it about the English class system, which would have been much more prevalent then anyway, because it's set hundreds of years ago. But I really wanted to sort of deal with that aspect because it's inherently English, and it was a very English story I was telling, and so that was one of the kind of threads I wanted to weave in there.
Okay, so I think we will introduce. So the film we're going to be looking at today is The Shout from 1978, as directed by Hertzey Skolimowski.
Greater than the frightening power of exorcism. More mystifying than any omen of reincarnation. The soul-shattering experience of The Shout.
So, Sean, when was the first time you came across this film?
I came to this film relatively late. It was a film I was aware of, but had never seen. And partly because I think, and this is not necessarily changed to a huge extent now, I don't think it ever had much of a reputation when I was younger. Um, so I was certainly aware of it, but it was not one of those that I had high on my list of, oh, I've got to check that out. I've got to see that. Um, and then, years passed and eventually Network released the Blu-ray of
Yes.
it, which I would assume would probably have been within the last 15 years or so.
Yes, yes.
And at that point, I thought, oh, I'll pick that up because, what the hell, it's out on Blu-ray. I'll finally give it a look. And so I think I picked it up probably in one of their sales, and put it on and was just blown away by it. I was like, I can't believe that more people are not talking about this film. And I think partly that's because it's sort of odd and idiosyncratic and doesn't fit neatly into boxes. But also, in terms of, it is a very English film and it does a lot of the things that you've sort of alluded to. But it feels, in terms of how it's made and the style of it, it also feels not quite English, which
Yes.
is what's fitting because obviously it was made by a Polish director. But it's one of the more sort of Lynchian horror films, even, before he even kind of staked out that turf. But if you look at it now, aspects of it feel very dreamlike in that way that Lynch films don't always quite add up narratively or entirely make sense, but that somehow adds to them. I think The Shout is very similar in that regard. It's quite an opaque film. There are bits of it that don't quite fit together, but that somehow helps it, I think. But I can see that those are also the sort of elements that would frustrate some audiences.
Yeah, I mean, a very similar story with me. I picked up the Network Blu-ray a few years ago now, but yeah, I came to it very late. I'd heard of it like yourself, but not. I'd never really seen mention of it in many of the sort of books about British horror that I'd read. Really, it did seem as though people were either just not aware of it or they weren't celebrating it. Because when I first saw it, very much like yourself, it's like, what is this? This is just blown, exactly your words, blew me away. It's an incredible film. And I think, yeah, like you said, I mean, it's that in it, in many ways, like a lot of those kind of films where, something like, Nicholas Roeg going over to Australia to make Walkabout, or even the Canadian Ted Kotcheff making in Australia again, Waking Fright. It's this idea, it captures absolutely the feeling of that country at that time, but it also has this kind of outsider's viewpoint, which makes it feel slightly off kilter, which is, I mean, the whole idea of, The Shout starts with this cricket match in the grounds of a lunatic asylum or a mental hospital, and it
Yeah.
there's just something about those opening cinema verite. It looks like a documentary. You've got the nurses and the old guys in the deck chairs. There's something so English about that, but it there's something not quite right.
Also,
Like
the
someone
idea of this the complete incongruity of like having a bunch of lunatics playing this incredibly ordered game with like cricket, which is all
yeah.
very, very mannered and lots of rules, and is not as it's not as free and open as a game of football or rugby or anything like that. And it sets up this completely surreal world right from the get go.
And I think as well, I mean, obviously that this film would have been made in 77 and it came out in 78. And I think as well, not to overdo it or over egg the cake, if you like, but I do think, I was 8 in 1978, so and I still have fairly vivid memories of that world and that world being for me other things as well, mainstream things, ordinary things, school and all the kind of stuff that kids do and pop and crisps and that, but also very much aware that there were weird stuff on the horizon. So I can remember, I think Tales of the Unexpected started in 1978. You got the classic horror double bills in the summer that would be on BBC Two. You got and films like, The Shout. Obviously, I wouldn't have seen The Shout at the time, but and also, you've got those memories of the sort of public information films, and and Apaches came out, I think, the same year, or it's like maybe the year before. All this stuff that was
Yeah,
just,
I would have
you
seen it
know,
around then, I think.
being wheeled into the assembly room in primary schools so we could watch Picture Box and be kind of, you know, be kind of obsessed with it and terrified at the same time. All this kind of stuff it was just floating around, and it wasn't. Now if you have something sort of weird, it's kind of highlighted as being weird. But I think the thing in the 70s and in the 80s, but slightly lesser so, in the 70s, it was just kind of interwoven throughout very ordinary stuff. You'd get just fucking crazy shit. It's like looking back, it's very
Yeah,
obviously
yeah.
crazy shit, but then it was like, oh right, okay, this is on now. I'll watch this then. I've just watched a Bugs Bunny cartoon. Oh, what's this? It's some sort of stop frame animation Soviet critique of capitalism. What? It was just all this stuff, and it's
Yeah,
like
I mean,
nobody was in
culture
control.
culture was just a lot weirder then. It's sort of difficult to explain to people now that things were just it was sort of like all bets were off. And so the BBC would make a lot of weird supernatural TV, which in no way in hell would they make now. We're lucky if we get Mark Gatiss doing a ghost story for Christmas every year. And even those are nowhere near as strange or unsettling as the ones they made, in the 70s. In the same way, you had a big English company like Rank making a film like The Shout. I mean, imagine trying to get The Shout financed in this country now; it would be impossible. But yeah, it was and this was everywhere, even for kids. It was when we were kids. It was a lot more acceptable for us to be exposed to all this sort of horror and strangeness. Kids' TV was a lot weirder then. Everything was not quite as safe as it is now, which is why I think a lot of this stuff has lasted and still looks interesting today because there's really nothing else like it.
No, and I think, I guess it. I mean, I think the other film, I've not really delved into Skolimowski's stuff really. The only other film I've seen by him is Deep End. I don't know if you've seen Deep End.
Yeah.
Yeah, Deep End. I mean, Deep End is I mean that he did this before. Deep End's kind of like, I think, 1970, 70 or 71. It's got Jane Asher in it, and it's mostly filmed or a lot of it is filmed in on location in London, but some of it is filmed in Germany as well, I think. But it again, like this film, the Deep End is not really supernatural as such, or it doesn't have these kind of weirder elements like The Shout. But again, it does really capture the Shout is great at capturing sort of this weirdness that was emerging towards the end of the 70s. And I think Deep End's really good at capturing that grotty horror show that was the sort of early 70s. I mean, you get to see before I mean, Soho's been very much cleaned up. It's a different place now, but you get to see in Deep End, you get to see the actual kind of the terrifying sort of Vice Squad horror show that was Soho at that time. And but also the interiors of places, they look, bed sits and stuff like that, it just looks horrible. And, this is what people, when they make kind of revised films of the 70s, they completely, they concentrate on the flares and the wigs and all that, but what they don't really understand, unless you lived through that, was how grim it was. And most people were still living in very much post-war conditions, peeling wallpaper and all this. It's much, the 70s is much more rising damp than it is kind of Studio 54 if you were living in this country.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly sort of plenty of films, English films made by English directors reflect that as well. But again, with Deep End, there's something unsettling about it. I think Scott Mofsky is very good at that, just that kind of underlying weirdness to English life that perhaps people who are from here took for granted, but I think he really sort of ferrets it out and is sort of like, no, this way of living is deeply strange. And he puts that all on screen, and then you go, yeah, actually it kind of is.
Yeah, and I think is what, Deep End's got this great sort of a cameo from Diana Dawes, and I think, it's one of those, because obviously she was kind of this sex bombshell in the 1950s and 60s, and then in the 70s, she had, a career was kind of going a different way, and she put a little bit of weight on and stuff, which is fine, but but it's very much, there's a definite change. And I think as soon as if you see a kind of see Diana Dawes in a sort of 50s or 60s films, it signifies one thing, and then you see Diana Dawes in a sort of 70s film, it signifies something completely different.
Yeah, it
She's
shows it kind of shows you the sort of the country in microcosm. Really, it's a
yeah.
faded, parody of what it once was.
You see her popping up in these little cameos. So she's in, obviously, in Deep End, and obviously the Amicus, the segment of From Beyond the Grave, and I think she's in a Steptoe film as well. Yeah, and she very much, her presence on screen very much represents a certain kind of mythology of kind of these kind of slightly dodgy women, and who are, yeah, it's really interesting, I think, Deep End. But I think, obviously with the Shout, we've got something very, very different in, so it's very similar in some ways, but very, very different in others. And of course we've got, it's just this I mean, like the farmyard where, or the farmhouse where they're sort of living. um it's very much the, because again, around the same area you get like these kind of play for todays, and I think there's some of those great play for todays where, Penda's Fen, and things like the Photograph, and all this kind of stuff. And it's very much about sort of almost like middle class interlopers on working class life, and they want the sort of the bits of the countryside, or the bits of that which appeal to them, that they can redecorate and remodernize or whatever, but they're not prepared to deal with everything that comes with it. And I think there's a certain amount of this, but I think the farmhouse is very sort of it doesn't necessarily look like a middle class idyll. It just looks like an old shack.
No, because if anything, the characters are sort of more, I suppose, not necessarily hippies, but kind of counterculture. In that, I
Yes.
mean, John Hurt's character is this experimental musician.
Yeah, he's got one of these
So
classic 1970s
someone
non
who's
jobs. Imagine having that
yeah,
job now.
yeah, you sort of think And the only sort of remotely useful function he seems to serve is like playing organ at the local church. But when he's at home, he's just like experimenting with like musique concrète, and you sort of think, how are you people making a living? It's just, but
Yeah.
again, you sort of think, well, they've obviously sort of fled the city and have ended up in this sort of like, which what have been would have been then, I'm sure, sort of a cheap place to live, this slightly dilapidated farmhouse where he gets to just hide away, do his experimental music, and sleep with the local women.
If I shouted for you now, you would die. As would your wife and anyone else around here.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, he does have a very distinctive look and feel, and I think that takes us back into what we're talking about that the unique feel of kind of British or English, even English films from that era. Linking into those earlier influences of like your M.R. James adaptations and stuff like that. But obviously, again, it does very much its own thing, and it's very odd it's odd in a way that even people who like odd things might like, but are slightly confused about, because it is. I mean, the plot is. I mean, obviously based on the Robert Graves short story, um, but we've got this couple who are in this rundown farmhouse next to the sea or whatever, this kind of country sort of life. And so this is kind of a lot of the stories told in flashback. So we see what's happened later on, and so we've got um we've got John Hurt and Susanna York, and then their lives are kind of turned upside down by the arrival of Crosley, played by Alan Bates. And yeah, I mean, what's your take on Alan Bates? Because I've got my thoughts on Alan Bates, but I'll come back to you.
Well, I mean, in this film specifically, I mean, I think he's one of the sort of great horror movie monsters, in that way that when you've got these very articulate um, men played by classically trained actors, um, that they're sort of intellectual monsters. There's something sort of deeply hypnotic and powerful about them, and I kind of sort of group him together with the sort of character of John Mauler in the Medusa Touch,
Yes.
played by Richard Burton. And I sort of view them as being very much of a piece. They're these sort of incredibly powerful men who have these like unearthly abilities, but are very sort of charismatic and intelligent at the same time. And I think that's a really sort of interesting subset of movie monsters.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like, Alan Bates to me, rightly or wrongly, he kind of came up, you know, around the same time as Albert Finney, and I think the two sometimes are kind of they are very different, but they are kind of interlinked in some ways, particularly because they came out of that sort of kitchen sink, that sort of British new wave in the sort of late 50s, early 60s. So you had obviously Albert Finney in Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, and then Alan Bates in A Kind of Loving, but also they were both kind of in The Entertainer as well. But I think the difference, but obviously they are different actors. But I think that the key thing for me with those two is that you with say Albert Finney, as much as he has this kind of whatever character he's playing, there I think there is this kind of there is underneath it all, even if he's playing someone that's not perhaps morally as correct as we'd want them to be, there is this kind of warmth. There is you feel like there's a soul there somewhere. Even if Arthur Seaton in Saturday Night Sunday Morning, he's a bit of a bastard, but he's the way, and I think you can read that as him being a bastard. But I think the way that Finney portrays him, there is this warmth to it. There's this soul, it's this. He's got this twinkle in his eye. So it's the way he looks at certain characters that you understand that there is more to this person, and he is kind of going through this existential crisis for all his kind of swagger. Whereas I think Alan Bates He's a superb actor, and I would agree with everything you said about that. There is certainly more of a kinship between him and, say, Richard Burton in the Medusa Touch. But I think it's not, if you had to use one word to describe Alan Bates, I think it's intense, and I think it in some ways. I can't say this for sure, but I feel like that Matt Berry created his whole persona based on Alan Bates'
Yes.
film. It's just like that is Matt Berry. He's the Matt Berry character.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think also, I think in this, Alan Bates, he's not ever trying to make you like him.
No, no.
That character is he's not ingratiating in the slightest, either in the film or to the audience. I mean, this is a character who invites himself round for a Sunday dinner, and then at the dinner table starts talking about having murdered his own children. So this is not someone who's interested in like impressing his hosts. And Alan Bates commits to that. There's never as you say, that kind of warmth that Finney has. He's like, no, this guy is an utter bastard. He's a madman, and I'm going to commit to that. And so you're never kind of like secretly like into Crossley. It's just sort of like, no, this guy's an absolute monster.
Well, I mean, being a very petty Englishman, I think this is where you can tell that it's been made by someone who was not born in this country. Because to me, yeah, all right, he talks about murdering children, but it's the fact that he's invited himself round to Sunday dinner. It's like, how un-English is that? Who does that? Who invites himself round to dinner? That's he's a monster at that point.
Well, to me, this is one of the things that I love about the film, in that it's kind of part of that unique sort of subgenre of horror movies, which are not just English, but there is something very English about them. And I think that we've probably made quite a few of them, where terrible things happen to seemingly nice people because they're too polite to do anything about it. And as I say, I mean, we're not the only people who make those kind of films, because certainly Speak No Evil would operates on similar lines. But there is something so horribly English about this complete madman inviting himself round for Sunday dinner and not leaving, and them not being able to get rid of him because they're both I mean, Susanna York obviously sort of falls under his thrall fairly quickly, but her is essentially too weak and too polite to do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in some ways, this film is kind of dominated by Alan Bates and that central performance. That's the character you can't take your eyes off. But yeah, obviously Susanna York and John Hurt are very good, and I think John Hurt, obviously he had a long career. Obviously, he's no longer with us now, but he had this, hugely long career, and he did a number of different things, and he could turn his hand to a lot of stuff, and he was he could do quite challenging roles. But I think, like a lot of actors say, but I think more so with John Hurt, I think he was, particularly in those kind of 70s and 80s films, he was really good at being that kind of either playing some sort of simpleton or mentally deficient guy, or somebody with a huge weakness, or somebody or a kind of innocent character. And he just does that so well. I think, if you look at 10 Rillington Place, I mean, obviously it's based on reality, but what he brings to that, I mean, it's just this heartbreaking performance. I mean, it's such a grim film, but it's like, Jesus Christ, how has this happened? How has he convinced himself he's committed these murders? And they just go along with it. It's just incredible. And then, and obviously, Elephant Man a little bit later on, but, and even, Outsiders as well, Quentin Crisp, he was just your quintessential character. I know all actors play characters, but I think, character with a capital C. He was just incredible, John Hurt was, and I think he's brilliant in this as Alan Bates's foil.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, sort of incredibly versatile. As someone who's so sort of distinctive in terms of like how he looks and sounds, he could sort of disappear into all these different parts and was sort of equally good at playing a psychopath as he would be a sort of complete worm, which he sort of is in The Shout, really. And be sort of, yeah, equally convincing as both. So yes, he doesn't have. He's obviously a different kind of actor to Alan Bates, who has that sort of very classical air about him. But and you'd have to say in this, they're sort of brilliantly cast. They both play their respective roles perfectly.
Yeah, and I think because yeah, he's got his faults. I think the John Hurt character's definitely got his faults. He's not necessarily a shining example of a good husband or whatever. But yeah, I'm sure anybody deserves Crosley turning up. I mean, like you said, it's brilliant because it is so grim. But you look at it, and not I don't mean it unintentional, but it is funny. It's a black joke, and like you said, and it's based on this this extreme example of English reserve. It's almost a kind of it isn't because it's much better, but it's almost like a comedy sketch from Not the 9 o'clock News or something. It's just, what? Hello, love. Yes, yeah. I bought someone for dinner, darling. Yeah, he's a complete psychopath. He's going to tell you about how he murdered
Yeah,
some
no,
children.
there is sort of a feeling about a kind of black farce about it, especially when you get to the point where sort of Crossley starts influencing Susanna York, and he basically turns around to her and he's like, right, we're going to go upstairs now, and Jonathan Hurt's like,
Okay.
okay, and does absolutely nothing about it. And it is blackly funny, but also horrible.
Yeah. I mean, what is? I always ask this. I mean, because I've got my ideas, but I mean, what do you think's going on? I mean, other than that, he invades this couple's life. In terms of because we get hints of what's happened in the past, and it's very sort of it's like this broken narrative, and we get bits and pieces, and he's talking about him coming, talking about sort of Australia and sort of coming across the shaman and all this kind of stuff. What's your take on what's happened to him and how has he ended up with this magical power where he can kind of because obviously for those that aren't aware the shout refers to the fact that he can unleash this shout which is has a damaging physical effect.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the other really interesting things I think about the film is the fact that it's essentially told by an unreliable narrator,
Yeah.
which is sort of one of the reasons I picked it for this because my novel Corpse Road similarly plays with the idea of unreliable narrators, or one or possibly two. Um, and this film very clearly sets that out. It's Crossley narrating his own story, telling it to Tim Curry as they sit scoring this cricket game. But he openly says he's sort of like, I'm going to tell you this story, but I always tell it different ways just to keep it interesting for me. I vary some of the details, etc., etc. So he sort of openly says at the beginning that this is not necessarily the truth of exactly what happened. This is a version of it. And we see early on that Susanna York and John Hurt are both present at the cricket match, and you sort of start to question, are they the people in the story, or is he just imagining them in his story? And it sort of plays all these little games with, how questioning how much of what he's telling you actually happened. I mean, ultimately, in the end, given what sort of happens at the finish of the film, there does seem to be at least some truth to this idea that he has these powers. But as to the specifics of the story, they're very sort of questionable. Um, and beyond that, I mean, Crossley just seems to be this force for chaos. He doesn't necessarily have any real preconceived aims. He just sort of like, as it being a coastal film, it's almost like he washes up at their house and wreaks havoc and does what he wants to do. And he has no real ambition beyond that. And when he's narrating it from the lunatic asylum, you don't get the sense that he's any less happy there than he would be anywhere else. It's just a case of he just drifts through life, amusing himself as he goes along.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's very. I think this film in particular, it's almost. I mean, like I said, it came out in a particular era, and as you quite rightly said, it's very doubtful. I mean, this might be an independent feature that would have to take 7 years to raise the money for, but
Yeah.
obviously, a main studio is not going to touch this now, which doesn't mean, before I get people start writing postcards into me, I don't, there are some fantastic films coming out in the 21st century. I've talked about them a lot. There's some brilliant stuff coming out, but I think in general terms, it, I think this is a film. It's a film that you need, but in some ways, given a lot of modern audiences, I think it's a film that they don't deserve, because I think it's again, I'm talking very general terms. I'm not talking about specific niche audiences. I'm talking general terms. I think that a lot of audiences, I think once it's a double-edged sword. I think once you kind of, if you trust an audience, you can put stuff out there. You know, whatever you think about Oppenheimer, that was, it's an intelligent film and it's quite slow paced, but it's fascinating and people obviously responded to that. But I think there's such a need from studios to gatekeep and not really understand the lessons of past successes. The classic example that I've used before, Barbie's a massive hit, and what do the executives learn from that? Let's do another Mattel product, not let's look at what
Sure, yeah.
the individual elements of that film was that made it popular. So I think so, but I think the other side of it is that a lot of the time there are films, and I'm the first one to admit I like esoteric stuff. I like being slightly confused. I like odd things. So I do lean that way. But I think in general, a lot of audiences they struggle with things that I don't think are that confused. I think a lot of people, clearly the latest Joker film, I thought it was good. I thought it was good. It was just good to do something different with that kind of superhero model that was kind of trashing it in some ways. But people really struggled with the ending. They struggled with the structure. And I thought it's not that complicated. It's not like an avant-garde masterpiece. It's just a slightly odd take on the superhero feature. But people have really struggled with it. So, something like The Shout.
Well, I mean, part of the problem is when you have an industry that's increasingly based around formula and IP, whenever you buck that formula, you might get into choppy waters with audiences because it's not what they've been led to expect. That's the problem when the more idiosyncratic stuff is being pushed over to the margins. If you're not used to being challenged like that, then anything remotely challenging suddenly becomes as a real shock. A film like The Shout, I mean, even then it must have been somewhat confusing for people because it doesn't entirely tie up all of its narrative loose ends, and it plays these little games, and it doesn't even, there's sort of a core plot point in the film which is to sort of do with the idea that people's souls are somehow contained within these stones, but it never really makes any attempt to explain that or lay out how that might happen or the sort of folkloric backdrop of it. It just presents it in the film and you're sort of left to figure it out. And that's something that must have, it was probably a bit of a leap even then, Nowadays, if I tried handing in a script with anything like that in, you'd be immediately barraged with notes, sort of saying, "Well, you need to explain this. What's the backstory? What's going on?" And yeah, it's the films that are able to do that, that are allowed to sort of take those narrative risks, are sort of increasingly hard to make, I think.
But I think it's kind of like it. Also, I think what people kind of forget is that you have, say, a film like this or other examples where there are these kind of deliberate gaps, or there are these sections that are deliberately opaque. Um, and I think at first glance people go, well, that don't make sense. They've not written that very well. And I'm like screaming, no, that's the best writing. Leaving these gaps.
Yeah.
That's not laziness. That's really well plotted ideas going onto the page. And it's the hardest thing to do. The easiest thing to do with writing is to overwrite and just to fill in those blanks. But to step back and remove them and make it to challenge your audience and to make it harder for them, that's really, in my book, that's really good writing. But and obviously,
Sure, and it's not even just making it deliberately hard for them. It's allowing them the space to inhabit the story themselves. It's sort of like leaving things open to interpretation and saying, "What do you think?" That's inviting them into the story to sort of have their own take on it. I don't think that's necessarily just about making it hard for audiences. I
no,
think it's
no.
actually involving them.
I think it's it's the writing equivalent to the understated actor. I think that's difficult. It's very easy to overact, but it's not so easy to leave those gaps and to take a step back and be reserved and restrained. And I think that's why, getting back to Alan Bates, I think that's why it works. He is very intense, but he is capable of having those quieter moments, because if it was just on 10 all the time, it wouldn't work. It'd just be
Yeah.
annoying. That's what Matt Berry is. That Matt Berry is kind of like I love Matt Berry, but he is the parody of that. But obviously Alan Bates knew what he was doing in terms of keeping it low and then exploding into these erratic sort of these spiels he comes out with. Yeah, but I think it's just a film, as you said. It wouldn't be you couldn't make this now. And I'm not saying that in a kind of, oh, it's too woke or whatever. Where I mean, it's just, it's not going to fly with the money man. But it's a shame, because I think if
No.
you allow people to appreciate things, and this is why it's great. I mean, obviously I do work at the Broadway and stuff like that, and I do film courses and things. And it's great that Broadway and other places have like these kind of film festivals, which, a lot of these films won't get shown anywhere else other than these kind of horror or cult festivals. And, so these films like The Shout, that are slightly more esoteric or slightly off kilter, they are getting made, but, no big studio is going to necessarily put money behind it, which is,
No, they're, and if they're being made, they have to be made on significantly less money. I mean, with The Shout, you're talking a film that has major stars in it.
yeah.
Alan Bates was a star, and Susanna York was a star. John Hurt at that point was probably not as big a star as he would become, but these are name actors, and the idea of sort of making a film with an equivalent kind of cast now, I think you'd be sort of laughed out of the industry.
Mm.
It just wouldn't happen, certainly in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a very different sort of prospect, really. But in some ways, it was nice to see it. I really liked it, but I don't know if you've seen The Substance, but that is, so in some ways it is an independent film. It's not a big Hollywood production, but it was good to see it getting this notoriety. I don't know whether it will do big business at the box office. I don't know, but it was kind of nice seeing a kind of almost like a society-esque film starring a household name like Demi Moore in this weird sort of feminist fantasy, strange, odd, over the
Yeah,
top
I
horror
kind of
film.
loathe the substance, but I see your point.
I really liked it. I just thought it was, you know, I see there's a few films I've seen this year. So Kinds of Kindness, The Substance. There's another film I saw as well. In fact, it was Joker Part Two, I think. And I saw these films at the Broadway, which is kind of like, an art house kind of crowd. And every single performance at those films I saw, um, people walked out. And especially, I think four
Right,
people
yeah.
walked out of The Substance, and I was like, yeah. I mean, so I get if people don't like it, but I'm much happier that that film exists, because that to
Sure,
me,
yeah, and I think my reasons for not liking it are probably not the same as those people that walked out,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
I probably didn't like it any more than they did.
yeah. So, any last thoughts on The Shout?
Well, I'd say if you're at all interested in the sort of weirder edges of horror cinema, of things that are not obvious, that are very idiosyncratic, then I would say definitely seek it out. Um, every time I've shown it to someone who hasn't seen it, who likes this kind of film, this kind of weirdness in their film and in their fiction, they've loved it as much as I do. So I think if you are of that mindset, you will find a lot to like in it. I don't know how available it is now, given that sort of network went out of business. It's the sort of thing where there may still be Blu-rays out there, but it might suddenly get difficult to see again. So I would sort of say if you can pick it up anywhere, do, because it's well worth having a copy of on your shelf. Um, yeah, I mean it's like I say, I still, I think its reputation is probably somewhat better now than it was back when I first started getting into horror cinema, but it's still not a film that's widely enough known, I think.
No.
And it's one of, I think English genre cinema is full of these sort of weird little things that have slipped through the cracks, because we have the kind of classic stuff that everyone knows about, the Hammer and the Amicuses and all this sort of thing, but there's also a lot of just strange little films out there as well, which is sort of one of the things I wanted to get into England Screaming when I wrote that book. There are all these sort of like fascinating off kilter little movies that we've
Yeah,
made in this country, which is not necessarily what people think of when they think of British horror films, but to me are sort of like so massively distinctive.
yeah, stuff like The Sea and the Sand and stuff like that, and
Yeah,
all
yeah,
these
yeah,
kind of
totally.
weird
Yeah,
weird things on the edges, and they're not quite horror, but they're not quite not horror, And I think, again, like mentioning those kind of play for today things as well. I think, a lot of people have seen Penda's Fan, a lot of people have seen Robin Redbreast, but I think that's just as good, or if not better, is a Photograph. I think that's a
it's
really,
yeah,
if people like this, I think you'd like the Photograph, but also things that aren't horror at all, but they kind of feel as though they belong in the same sort of space. Play for today called Back and Beyond with Rachel Roberts, which is just brilliant. It's just fantastic. But yeah, a lot of those things, and I try and do like courses at the Broadway that, rather than just talking about sort of more those horror films that everybody knows, I try and do courses which certainly try and reflect those kind of less well-known sort of films that are either horror or sort of akin to horror. So I did a course a couple of years ago called Uncanny Britannia. So it's kind of like looking at the spaces and all the stuff, like you said, that falls between the gaps, because it's so rich. There's so much stuff out there. You could just, not that I'm suggesting you don't look elsewhere, but I think you could just spend the next 20 years just sifting through the kind of British stuff, and a lot of stuff that's been either physically lost or has just been forgotten about. Even not even horror, Matthew Sweet's book, Shepperton Babylon, is fantastic. I think as a resource to go through and look back and revisit and reframe that sort of British film history. But there's so much out there to explore that's interesting and strange and weird and odd and fascinating. Yeah, it just goes on and on and on. So, have you got, other than obviously you've talked about your film and the book, have you got any other plugs? Anything you want to plug, Sean?
Well, I mean, I should first just sort of say that I think we've sort of said that the film's coming out via Severin as part of as part of
Yep.
the second Haunts folk horror box set. The book is available now via PS Publishing. Um, Hopefully it's up on Amazon by now, but it's certainly available directly from their website as well. And that's available in both like a trade paperback and a limited hardback as well. And then beyond that, there's my sort of ongoing monthly Patreon, which is for fans of the two Screaming books. I write a new story set in that universe every month, um, which is sort of continues on that sort of tradition of mixing and matching all these different horror films and creating this kind of grand unified shared sort of universe of horror. And yeah, still having a lot of fun doing that. That's been running for probably 3 years now, so there's a good bunch of stories on there. If anyone wants to sort of pay their £5 a month, you'll get an awful lot of fiction for your money. And there's also an ebook published of like the pick of like the first year or so of the stories, called What Screams May Come, which is an ebook only, but that's available from Black Shuck Books. And then yeah, beyond that, just about to start shooting a new feature, so not
Oh,
too
wow.
much to say about that yet, but hopefully by this time next year that should be sort of rearing its head above the battlements. So yeah, just about to sort of get cracking on that. So more to come there, hopefully.
Real. Well, he'll keep us posted on that. And yeah, and I would just, reiterate, obviously, go out, find the Corpse Road. If you can, watch a copy of To Fire You Come at Last when it comes out on the box set or when it comes out on streaming. Please watch that. It is very, very good. And, please, if you've got any interest in horror and horror stories and linking narratives and things like that, please check out Sean's Screaming Stories, and especially the first two sort of hardback books. They're just brilliant. I can't. I'm not just saying this because Sean's here. I'm a massive fan of those books. They're just brilliant to read, endlessly fascinating. So yes, check those out. So it just remains for me to say thank you to Sean. Thanks for coming on again, mate.
Thanks very much for having me. Always a pleasure.
And remember to call round next time. Make yourself at home. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.